Hello and welcome to SonicLAB. Today we're looking at the Korg Wavestate, which is the latest in wave sequencing technology from Korg. This is actually, they call this version 2.0. Originally the first Wavestation was, well, gosh, I guess it would have been late 80s, early 90s. I should probably have found out really, but nonetheless, it was a very popular synth. It brought none before seen kind of sequencing of waveforms and sample-based synthesis together with some analog stuff. The Korg Wavestate is digital. This is a fully digital synthesizer. It's all DSP, but it features wave sequencing 2.0, which has much more going on. This is a 64 voice digital synthesizer. It's an all plastic affair. It's actually very, very light. It's surprisingly light, even though it has the sort of look to a degree of the Minilogue and the Minilogue, that kind of casing. It's definitely not that. It's very, very lightweight, has full-size keys. Velocity does not transmit aftertouch, but it does respond to aftertouch and poly aftertouch. Essentially, this is a 4-engined synthesizer. We've got 4 layers, which can be run in splits and layers or external MIDI channels. We've got this wave sequencing, which runs multiple channels of sequence. Wave sequencing is... it's a very specific kind of sound. Perhaps if I play you a couple of patches, you'll get it. I mean, back in the day, it was all over kind of cop dramas, lots of TV media composers. It was very expensive initially, and it was enable you to kind of create these sort of moving sequences and almost sort of like sample drum machine. And let me play. There's one example. Basically what we do is we sequence strings of samples up to 32 steps together with timing and other things. So we can play in each step. So there's very much a sort of tempo-based thing going on here, which will suit some people and perhaps not so others, but we can also crossfade between them. It's incredibly deep, and legendarily the initial Wavestation was very difficult to program. I mean, partly because it didn't have much going on in the GUI. The Wavestate has a lot more control. It's also got this LCD, which is, you know, the basic, but it gives us a lot of information. There is a lot of menu diving and a lot of kind of double functions and a lot of things going on because it is a complicated synthesis technology, and it's also quite unfamiliar. Even though it combines regular synthesis, we've got filters, we've got LFOs, we've got envelopes. There's a lot of other stuff inside. So let's just take a look at the connections. We've got a 12 volt DC power supply, which is included. Power switch. This does have the annoying off after 4 hours. So you can set that in the settings. MIDI in and out on standard MIDI jacks. USB MIDI. Damper pedal. Left and right 1/4 inch jack outputs and a dedicated headphone output, which doesn't appear to have its own volume level. That's it for your connections. We've got this joystick here, which is for vector synthesis. Vector synthesis allows us to move between multiple layers, either using envelopes or just the joystick. It's kind of like a crossfader, although it sometimes sounds a little bit more complicated than that. Each layer also has 3 effects, plus a master EQ and a master reverb. So at the core of this are the sample-based oscillators. It's all samples. There's no VA. It's all based on a sample set. And there's 2 gigs of ROM in here, or sample ROM. We can't load user samples, but there are multi-sample pianos. There are also lots and lots of different one-shot waveforms. Probably the easiest thing to do is to maybe go in and show what a single layer is. And I'm going to go hit performance. I'm just going to go up to an init performance. And this is the sort of basic building blocks. In init performance, that's 1 layer on here, so that's layer A. Now if I play a note, we've got set list, which changes programs, and then we've got wave sequence. So I'm going to go into the sample, and we can see that there's actually movement between 2 waveforms. I can turn that so that it's just one, and then if I want to change the waveform, let's press the waveform select, And then we can either set this to be a wave sequence mode, or single multi-sample mode. And then I can select from all of these single multi-sample, go down. So already seeing I'm doing quite a lot of this. There's a lot of this going on in pages and moving the cursor around. So I've got the acoustic multi-piano, but there's all of these attack portions, cymbal, drums, hits, keys, clavinets, organs. And this is where you start to think, oh, this reminds me a little bit of the 1990s when I was perhaps programming my JV 1080 or similar sample and synthesis. And you'd be right, it's very similar to that. And there is a massive list of samples in here. I mean, you can go from the top very quickly to the bottom, but it's all the stuff in between. I don't know how many there are here, but there must be hundreds of them. Should point out it is possible by clicking, if I come back in again, clicking page, I can change the filter and the sort order by different kinds, hit enter to apply, and then I can come back and I can have the collection. Plugin Guru did a load of sounds for this. There's original wave stations and the new Wavestate, hit enter. I mean, but this is a lot of button presses to kind of filter it out in Z to A, oldest category, blah, 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 blah. If we come back to it being a wave sequence, then hit the list of available waves, we've got all these kind of pre-built sequences, and you can see the various steps on there. There's some really complex ones, and these are all sort of pre-built that we could then sort of load into the main patch. It's easy to load stuff in, but all of them, quite often these are not what you want. So if we just come back again, I'm going to the sequence and I'm going to go to my wave sequence digipick. What I want to do now is I'm going to select the sample that's actually on this step. So there's a difference. So coming back here, we'll go to my, I think there's an init, I don't know where are the init wave sequence. So that's my starting point. You do need to get familiar with this because this is the way this thing operates. So if you're expecting a kind of Minilogue experience, it's really not that at all. So let's just come back to my init wave sequence, which gives me just 2 steps, and I can change these. So I'm in on my sample wave sequencer lane, which means I can assign samples to each step. I press this one first, and I can set the sample to be any one of, again, a whole bunch of different samples. Then I can move to the second step and assign it that way. I've also got these other parameters set, such as octave, the semitone, the fine tuning, the level, offsets. But if I want to add steps to my sequence, so the initial sequence has only 2, you know, I would think I can press shift and then this or something, but that's not how it works. Actually, what you've got to do is you've got to go to your third page and then say, right, I want to add steps to the end. I can do it for that lane or all lanes, which means it'll be for all of these 7 lanes of wave sequence data, which some of sample, pitch, shape, gate, step sequence, and lots of different ways of modifying the whole kind of the timing and the playback and the pitch and the gate length of the sequence. So I will now add, what was I going to do? I'm just going to go shift, will take me to the last page. I'm going to add it to all lanes, and I'm going to add 14 steps because I've already got 2. So now I just hit enter. So now I come back and you can see that on here, if I come back to my sample length, I can actually change the length of the loop and then assign a different sample to each of the loops and have them trigger how they want, and they can all be cross-faded. There's so many ways in which they can be triggered and move between, and the order in which they play. I mean, it's insanely deep and complicated. And remember, there are 4 of these engines, each with these 7 lanes of wave sequencing data. So bearing in mind, we've only really looked at the sample, which is the actual sample that's loaded in each step of the wave sequence. There's also another lane of separate pitch controls for that sample. There's also a shape lane which allows us to kind of modulate the amplitude and other parameters. There's a gate length for each step. There's also a step sequence, and each of these can have its own length. They can all be independent, and they're governed by this thing called the timing lane. And the timing lane is something that kind of, like I say, governs all of the other tracks, but it's much more complicated than that. So pressing the timing range, we can set the speed of that to be a multiple of the master tempo, which if we just start at 1, then each step has its own duration, its own probability, a crossfade time, crossfade in and out, whether it's note or gate, and that can be, again, at a different length. So the timing lane could be going this fast, and the other lanes can be going kind of at a multiple of that. I mean, it's insane, really. So then again, we go to the sample. We've also got probability of that as well, and probability of the transpose, where we can set these, and the shape. The shape's quite interesting because you can use it to modulate parameters and also the volume, so you get these kind of interesting envelope shapes and LFO type shapes like chugs and whatnot, and then gate, again, each step has its own gate length and probability, and the step sequence has its own value and modulation and probability. I mean, once you start adding all of these up, and remember, each of these is per note, so if I just play, it's like an LFO is cycling for each note that I play. So each time a note is played, the wave sequence triggers off for that note, and then there's the next one. I can change that. I just press sync notes, and then that will basically trigger them all together. It's a bit like having LFO sync, but you can imagine, that's all of those things per note. And managing that is kind of quite a big job via this interface, even via this expanded interface. There's also an envelope per voice, per filter, per amp, per pitch and per vector, and also LFO, filter, amp, pitch and pan per voice, per section. So it all starts to get kind of quite overwhelming quite quickly, and it's unsurprising we can create these incredibly complicated sounds with it, but they're also quite complicated to program and conceive, just getting your head around what is possible. Maybe what I should do is play a couple of my sounds. So I've created some sounds in it. In Nip Performance, I'm going down here. These are all not numbered, by the way. So I've called mine MBs. So we can store them on these things called set lists. So I could bring them up here. And that's quite useful. There are 4 banks of 16. So for the performer, very useful. So this one's called Big Brass, and it's multi-sample and a wave sequence layer plus a couple of extra multi-samples. I mean, yeah, it's not the most contemporary sound, but it's something that I wanted to sort of illustrate how it was made. So let's just deconstruct that. On the first layer, I've got this brass sample. I should mention we can actually double tap on these buttons to switch layers on and off. So we select layer 1 and we're just listening to layer 1. This also works on the effects as well. We've got a double tap, which is kind of useful. So layer 1 is basically single multi-sample, which is trombone and octaves. So that'll be this guy, which is quite skinny. It's not what you call the biggest, kind of girthiest sample. Then on the next layer, I've got just a regular wave shape. So if I hit select that, it's just a wave saw. But what I'm actually doing is I'm modulating this, the amplitude, to give it that kind of movement. Let's come back to this. Then my layer C is triggered only when I hit hard enough, so it brings in this timp, and then layer D adds this timp roll. So very simple, there's not much wave sequencing going on, but it's worth mentioning that, because of what you can do within the performance. In fact, if we come back to the performance and I hit performance here, and I'm just going to, actually maybe I should go to that shot, shift, I can page through all of the parameters. So I've got the level for each layer, I've got the velocity switching, so you can see the top two layers are switching in a higher velocity. I've got keyboard zoning, I've got transposition for each layer, I've got trigger on, key on, you know, there's all kinds of parameters. So as a multi-timbral sort of synthesizer, it's actually very powerful because we've got up to 4 layers. Remember, there are 64 voices. I think these are stereo voices. We could have another keyboard to the side that was playing a layer that wasn't being triggered by the keyboard. You know, or we can have any sort of mix and match. So as a sort of sound source, it's really flexible and it's got some great parameters for setting all of that stuff up. Okay, so let's bring it back to the kind of building blocks, the basics now. So looking at the filter here, we've got multiple types. These are all modelled in DSP, and there's quite a lot of additional parameters. The first one is the polysync. Poly 6, if I just play a chord, bring the resonance up. Quite nice and smooth, actually. Like, I'm not hearing any stepping there. Then we've got an MS-20 filter, which actually sounds quite authentic. It's got that sort of zippy, those zippy harmonics. We've got a low pass MS-20 as well. Oh, sorry, a high pass MS-20 as well. I don't know if it's got quite those low harmonics of the real thing. Then we've got other filter types. We've got the ability to have a 2-pole low pass, all these different kinds of filters. And each filter kind of has these additional parameters. So we can set the gain, we can set the trim. If we go to, for instance, to a low pass, 4-pole low pass filter, we would have, you know, the resonance type, standard or high, bass full or tight. So there's quite a lot there. And one last filter type is the multi-filter, which allows us to run a low pass, 2 filters in parallel, I think they are, or is it series? I think it's series actually. So if we go here, we can change between all of these filter types, and then let's try a band reject. I don't know what that's going to sound like. And there's, I guess there's a crossfade between the two. Anyway, lots to be playing with and plenty of filter types, and they're not badly modelled actually. We've got an envelope for the filter, amplitude, pitch, and the vector, which will animate the vector controls should we want that to. We'll show an example of that a little later on. Then each of these is a regular sort of envelope, but they've got, you know, so they have got additional parameters. So we've got the curves, and then we've got standard triggers, so we can trigger it from a bunch of places, modulation source. So I mean, there's quite a lot that we can do here. Trigger threshold, so it could come at a point of a cycle in an envelope, or a point of a cycle in an LFO, or a CC, or a velocity. There's loads of kind of quite clever stuff that we can do. Then we've got a bunch of LFOs. There are 1, 2, 3, 4 LFOs. Again, these are multi-wave, so if we come back to here, it's fairly standard fare. Let's see, where's my wave? Yeah, there we go. So we can just go through a whole bunch of different ones. Could be tempo synced, and you know, there are, again, there's not so many, but we've got offset, curve, fade in time, and randomization. So tons of sort of more traditional stuff, and that's the kind of the standard synthesis mode. The filters sound okay, envelopes okay, LFOs don't go all that high up. We haven't got any kind of audio rate mod synthesis stuff going on here. It's not really about that, this synth. So perhaps as something that kind of demonstrates a little bit more of the kind of thing that we can do with wave sequencing, I'm going to try and keep it simple, and I'll play some other presets that are a bit more sort of wowy and show-offy. But this is one where I've created this kind of groove, and it's literally... So what I got there is a basic groove going on together with a bass line, and the split is I've got the groove just on 3 keys and the bass line playing on the rest, and I'm using these performance knobs to kind of program one of them up to a mod destination that's affecting the speed of the LFO on the bass line layer. So it's pretty straightforward. If we just come to, again, initial layer is literally, it's just literally 1, 2, 1, 2. Pretty straightforward. Next layer is running the timing step. So the timing is running on this at double the speed, 2 times the speed. And then on my next layer, which is the bass drum, I've actually granulated it even more. So on the timing lane, it's running the normal speed. Second lane, I've got that step only running at semiquavers. So put them all together and I've got my groove. There are some presets in here that are fantastic examples of this, but it must have taken ages to do. I mean, currently there's no editor for this. There may well be a librarian coming along, but it's the sort of thing that you could spend a lot of time on getting something that's actually very cool, but you sort of feel like, is that time well spent, I suppose, for groove stuff. Where it gets really interesting is where we start to merge and mangle samples and crossfade between them. I'll show you a few more presets that show off a lot of that, which are not made by me, but are much more complicated. This one's called Iceland Piano, which has steps that feature kind of piano samples that are randomizing octaves and whatnot, and some other tinkle stuff. Then if I go to this guy, you'll also know that we've got that sort of seamless patch switching. So one patch overhangs the other, which is actually very cool. And this one is more of a sort of glissandi, well not glissandi, it's slow moving wave sequence, really nice, and it uses some of these mod knobs which are mapped in the modulation section. I don't know exactly what's doing what. They can either be performance mod knobs, which means they can control multiple layers, or they can be tied to a specific layer. So they're very powerful, but it does bring up the modulation section, and I was sort of dreading this because it's, you know, bear in mind what we've just been talking about with all the wave sequencing. The modulation section just takes things into a complete another level. So I'm hitting the mod button. The mod button brings up the mods, and in this instance we've speed and time, and you know, they're going all over the place, so we can create multiples of these. And the interesting thing about the modulation section is, as far as I'm aware, there's at least 1,000 possible combinations. So we're not limited to sort of 8 or 16 or 32. We can have a single knob going to up to 30 destinations at the same time, and that it can be knobs, it can be velocity, it can be LFOs, it can be envelopes. There's so many sources and so many destinations. If I go to an init patch and we just go to the mod section, there's nothing in the mod section, so I'm going to press mod plus. So now, let's say I'm going to target the cutoff. What do I want to do with the cutoff? At a basic level, I could just say, let's have the performance knob as the cutoff, and then I hit enter. Now I have my mod, and I can say, how much do I want it? So now, at the basic level, that controls that. Simple. That's really no problem at all. But we have got so much more, because remember, if we're using LFOs, again, these are kind of per voice. So we can modulate, say, well, we may as well get into, well, I don't know, what should we get into? Let's modulate the, if we go into the sample and we choose the step 1 and we say, let's say that's the octave of step 1. Now I'm going to hit mod and I'm going to hit enter, which means the destination parameter is sample step 1 octave. And I'm going to send that from, I don't know, let's take it from the amplitude LFO, right? Hit enter, and then, so let's say make that -2 octaves, come out. And now when I play, let's get a bit of reverb on there, bit of pitch. I mean, okay, that's one mod, a bit of pitch modulation, one wave, and a bit of reverb. So, you know, you can see how granular you can get with this, and that's why I can't go through every single feature. There are just too many. There's way too many to cover. But you start to get an idea. There are some limitations. I wanted to modulate, for instance, the wet and dry, because I thought that was quite nice. I can't modulate it from the LFOs or the envelopes because these are all polyphonic. So there's only a single destination, so it can't work like that. You can use polyphonic sources to polyphonic destinations, such as steps on wave sequences, but you can't use them the other way. If I wanted to modulate the master, I might have to get into something like, well, let's add it, let's try it. So we're going to, the wet and dry modulation source would have to be the vector envelope, which brings us neatly to the vector synthesis. Let's perhaps take a slight detour to the vector synthesis, and then we'll come back to what's going on with the modulation and how we can route that. How about that? So I'll start with this patch, which I've created because it's going to save a lot of time. And this is literally 4 layers, and they're all sounding at the same time. I can use the vector joystick to blend between them. And that's in essence vector synthesis. I mean, it's kind of that basic, so we can create. But because we've got vector envelopes, we can actually dynamically mix and blend over time between those. So what we would do to make that happen is we would hit our vector button, and then we have vector synthesis. So if I just come back out here, joystick edit. So I'm on layer, if we start here, let's go layer A. I'm going to start with, and I'm going to move the joystick over here. That's going to be my start point. That's going to be my next one. That's going to be my next one. That's going to be my next one. And then that'll be my last one. So I'm making it very simple. So it's just going to go like that around all the 4 sounds. So if I now press go, I'm setting the time it takes to go round these. It's a little bit unintuitive, but essentially that's the shape of it. I mean, so you can create these kind of blends between multiple layers, and you can have them move around, and they don't have to be just a straight pattern. You can draw kind of all sorts of weird nonsense in here, so you don't have to make them do what you want. They can have all sorts of crazy shapes. So now if we come back to a patch that I've written, which basically now routes the vector envelope D to the intensity of the reverb, I can now play. So what that's doing is using the vector envelope, which if we close up here, we can see that it's just a basic round and round, and I've got it tempo synced, so it's running at the fastest it possibly can. It doesn't quite work in the way you'd hope. It only works while you've got your hands down, so it would have been great to be able to route LFOs to monophonic destination. And I believe, you know, because there are maybe a couple of little bugs in the firmware. Sometimes it doesn't show a parameter being available in the mod matrix, you know, unless you come in and come out a couple of times. So I expect there will be a fix, because this is firmware version 1, and maybe we can have polyphonic source to a monophonic destination. That would be nice, please. The one thing that I will say for Korg, I mean, they really have crammed it full of stuff. I mean, it's almost the antithesis of what the Minilogue or the Minilogue kind of surface or instruments are, which is very much what you see is what you get. There is some stuff under the hood, but most of it's sitting on the front surface. With the Wavestate, it's sort of the opposite. You're seeing a bunch of stuff on the front surface, and you can use it like a traditional synthesizer, but all of that other stuff under the hood is deep, 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 deep. And as a result, I really think it would be almost imperative that they release an editor for this, because you want to make this as fun and as immediate to access this kind of synthesis as possible. And I know that's quite a challenge, but you know, it's a challenge that you sort of need to take on, because otherwise people who buy this synth, they're really just going to end up flipping presets and really not finding the depth of it. Because bear in mind, you know, this can be a 4-part multi-timbral synthesizer. So you could utilize it as a major part of your setup. If you're working on a budget, you maybe got a little sequencer or DAW, you know, you've got 4-part multi-timbrality and effects and all of those things. In fact, we should look at the effects briefly. So I've got this kind of 2-layer brassy kind of pad. Let's put some reverb on. Well, I say some. That's 100% wet. Take the time down a bit. In fact, if we have a look at some of the parameters, we've got size, we've got time, we've got timbre. Pressing shift gives us access to those. So bright and damping, but there's only basically 2 reverb algorithms in there. We'll take that off, and this is the master effect. Remember, this is common to all of the parts. In fact, that's one thing that would have been really cool, is to be able to sort of switch the send on and off from a particular part. So you could have some stuff with reverb and some without, rather than have it all over everything. Then we've got delay. See what parameters we've got. Time. But there's a few different types in here, quite a lot actually. Actually, tape echo is quite nice. When we come down and give it a lot of feedback. So you get a bit of that, and you can modulate these effects as well, although they're only a, remember, monophonic source. Then we got mod effects, which are kind of cool. Effects type, if we have a look, modern chorus, we've got chorus, vibrato, phasers, flanges, and then there's the pre-effects, which include compressors, EQs, and a ring modulator, which is kind of cool. So quite a lot to play with, all digital. Like I say, you can modulate a lot of those parameters, but only from monophonic sources. So that kind of, again, it sort of limits you to CC controllers or the vector envelopes. So that is the Korg Wavestate. As you can see, it's a very deep synthesizer. I hope I've been able to show most of what this can do. And that kind of reflects, again, you know, if you were to buy this synthesizer, you will need to invest some time in getting your head around the concepts. If you want to get the most out of it and sort of sculpt it to your needs, then prepare to get your finger button pressing and get deep into what it can do, because it can do a heck of a lot, which is both a blessing and a curse, depending on how you like your synthesizer, what kind of flavor you like. If you're into that kind of deep explorative stuff, then great. If you want analog immediacy, maybe not so much, because remember, all of the source samples are, all the source sounds, oscillators, are samples, and you can't put your own in there, which may put some people off. But it's priced at £699 UK, $799 US dollars, available now, or certainly arriving in the stores now. As I say, it's only firmware 1, so I imagine there's going to be a little bit of evolution on this, because it's all about the firmware, because this is a digital synth. But anyway, Korg Wavestate, thank you very much for watching. See you next time.